So, enough about me. I am delighted to say to introduce John Goodlad, who is a Shetlander. And he's been a Shetlander who has worked in the seafood industry throughout the whole of his career. In addition to this, he is also an author. And John has written 3 books. The first one is being the Cod Hunters, the second being the Salt Roads, which looked at how the fish in the sea have linked Shetland and Europe. And today's presentation is about his new book, which is going to be published next year, called Food from the Sea. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to John, and I'd like to give him a warm round of applause to welcome on stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Can I say how delighted I am to be back at the Orkney Science Festival? I've been lucky enough to have spoken at a few times now at the International Science Festival. It's just a delight. It's a wonderful festival. It's just the variety of speakers and the range of subjects just continues to fascinate me. And as a Shetlander, it's always a delight to come to Orkney. I was telling somebody today that as a Shetlander arriving in Orkney, it's funny, there's so much that's different and yet so much that's the same. And I could spend a whole evening talking about the similarities and differences between Orkney and Shetland. But tonight I want, as you've said, to talk about my new book. The last book I wrote was called The Salt Roads, and when I was writing The Salt Roads, it was looking at how fishing and the fish trade connected Shetland with Europe over hundreds of years. And I just loved writing the book. It was very close to my heart. And then towards the end of the book, I began to ask the question about sustainability. How sustainable is the modern fishing industry? And I really enjoyed that bit of reflection towards the end of The Salt Roads. And that prompted me to write the book that I'm working on just now. It will be called Food from the Sea. The future of seafood, and I'm looking at the interface between the seafood industry and the environmental movement. It's an interface that was very constructive about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and led to huge progress. It was a very trusting place, a collaborative relationship, but in the last few years it's become really a very, very difficult place, a place of lack of comprehension, and it's become rather angry and rather bitter. So what I'll do tonight is to look at that, and then to take 2 examples illustrating where that gulf has got us. One example I'll take is the recent proposal by the Scottish Government to introduce highly protected marine areas in Scotland. And the second example I'll use is the fish farming industry in British Columbia. And then finally, I'll ask the question, what can be done to try and bridge the gulf between these 2 sectors? So the context, the seafood industry and the NGO community. I should say that I've worked in the seafood industry all my career. I worked for the Fishermen's Organisation in Shetland. I was involved in several fish processing companies, and latterly I was a fish farmer, farming organic salmon and halibut. But for the last 10 or 15 years, I've also worked in the sustainability sector, working for the International Sustainability Unit, and I now advise some seafood investment funds on sustainable fishing and fish farming projects. So I would like to think that I can see both sides of the perspective, or the perspective of both sides, I should say. 20 years ago, as I mentioned, there was a very constructive dialogue. Organisations like World Wildlife Fund for Nature, Royal Society for Protection of Birds, Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, and others challenged, cajoled, and persuaded the seafood industry, the catching sector and the fish farming sector, to do things better, to gradually improve how fish were caught and how fish were farmed. And that resulted, I would argue, in a much more sustainable industry. Much of the modern seafood industry in Scotland, in Orkney and Shetland. Much of the catching sector is now certified by the Marine Stewardship Council, a global certification scheme that certifies fisheries according to how sustainable they are. If you go into Sainsbury's and some other retail outlets and you buy your fish, you'll often see a little blue box with a tick with MSC, and that's the certification that the fish has been caught sustainably. Similarly, in fish farming, there's been an increase in best aquaculture practice and aquaculture stewardship council certifications. So the industry, I'm far from blind to the industry's failings. There's much to be done and much that the industry isn't getting right. But compared with where it was 20 years ago, the industry is now in a much, much better place as seen by these certifications. And then something which I'm sure some of you will be aware of, but perhaps not all of you will be aware of, is the carbon footprint of seafood. I think as everyone now knows, and I think the vast majority of people on the planet recognize, climate change is probably the most existential issue that we're facing. And we're all extolled to try and minimize our carbon footprint, because the more greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere, the worse and the more rapid climate change is going to become. So we all know, try and reduce the number of long-haul flights we do, cycle instead of taking the car, try and walk, try and not waste heating. If you're driving a car, try to go hybrid or try to go electric. All of these things we know about, but about 20% of the global carbon footprint comes from what we eat. So food is actually very, very important, and we all should try to reduce our own personal carbon footprint by a careful choice of what we eat. And I'm sure many of you will be aware of the very, very powerful arguments for a vegan diet to reduce the carbon footprint, apart from any other arguments. Seafood has an incredibly low carbon footprint. Beef, to produce a kilo of beef, and these are figures from the corn-fed beef lots in the United States or Brazil, it takes about 60 kilos of greenhouse gases to produce 1 kilo of beef. Pork and lamb are much better, but there again it takes 12 to 15 kilos of greenhouse gases to produce a kilo of pork or lamb. Chicken is better, around about 8 kilos of greenhouse gases to produce a kilo of chicken. Fish is in a completely different zone. The carbon footprint of fish at maximum is around 3 or 4, and at minimum is much less. Farmed fish have a carbon footprint of between 2.5 to 4. Wild-caught fish, 3 to 4, depending on how it's caught. Some methods of fish catching, such as midwater trawling for mackerel and herring, is incredibly efficient, and the carbon footprint of these fisheries, you can get a kilo of mackerel with a carbon footprint of probably 0.7 greenhouse gases. And farmed mussels wins the carbon footprint contest with a carbon footprint of only 0.2 for a kilo of mussel meat. So the carbon footprint of seafood is incredibly low, and this is a hugely important thing for the seafood industry. As it's become more sustainable, it's also got this wonderful low carbon footprint. As I say in the conclusion to the Salt Roads, if you want to save the planet, eat farmed mussels for a starter and mackerel for a main course. So seafood's a climate-smart food. What's changed? In the last 2 years, there's now the environmental organizations that the seafood industry used to engage with, although they're still there, have been kind of eclipsed by some new kids on the block, some of the more radical NGOs. Open Seas, the Blue Marine Foundation and Oceana are just some of the examples. And for these NGOs, it seems that the global certification schemes aren't enough. They want to push the seafood industry further. We've also got a very uncritical media that seems to just love to regurgitate sensationalist press releases and don't interrogate what's being said. And the result of this radical NGO movement, which is becoming ever critical of the seafood industry, together with an uncritical media that simply repeats that, you've got a seafood industry that feels attacked, it feels under threat. And the result is, as I've said in my the heading to my lecture, we've kind of got a new culture war. Instead of the environmental community and the seafood industry working together, as they did 2 decades ago, we've got a culture war with the seafood industry and the environmental movement, or certain aspects of it, simply speaking to other people in their silos. So I'm going to now look at the 2 examples I mentioned to illustrate what's happened. The first is highly protected marine areas. The whole concept of highly protected marine areas has come out of a UN declaration which says that by 2030, 30% of the planet should be protected in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem. So 30% of the land and 30% of the oceans. Now that doesn't mean that within 30% of the oceans, fishing or fish farming should be banned. It simply means that within that 30% of the oceans, there needs to be extra care taken to ensure maximum biodiversity and ecosystem protection. And there's an interesting debate about what these closed areas might do or might not do. Should they be for the protection of the habitat? Should they be to preserve rare marine features such as merle beds, such as kelp forests, such as seagrass, such as deep water corals? And I think most people in the fishing industry would agree that that's what they're there to do, to protect these rare and endangered species. Other people in some of the NGOs argue that they're fisheries management tools in their own right. And they would argue that if you close an area to fishing, that's got to be good. You know, you stop fishing in an area, so it means the fish get a rest and fish stocks will grow and that'll be fine. It presupposes that you don't have fisheries management. And I think and around most of Scotland, most fisheries are now very, very well managed. Fisheries, the number of vessels allowed to fish are controlled by licence. The amount of fish they're allowed to catch is controlled by quota. The kind of gear they're allowed to use is controlled by regulation. So the entire area is managed. And if you close an area for fishing, all you will simply do is displace the fishing effort from one area of the sea to the other. And if you displace the fishing effort, the areas that are not closed will be fished more intensely in order for vessels to catch the quota and so on. It's a little bit like a balloon. If you take a balloon and you squeeze the air out of one part of the balloon, the air will just go to another part of the balloon. So the idea that closed areas can somehow enhance fisheries management, I believe, and I would argue, is false. And actually, it will make fisheries management worse because fishing effort is simply displaced. However, in 2021, the Scottish National Party and the Green Party entered into coalition, and the details of that coalition were known as the Bute House Agreement. And as part of the Bute House Agreement, at the insistence of the Green Party, was a proposal that 10% of Scotland's waters should be closed. These should be highly protected marine areas, and within that 10%, all fishing should be stopped, regardless of type of fishing. All fish farming should be stopped. In fact, all activity that could interfere with the seabed should be stopped. It was said that yachts wouldn't be allowed to anchor within highly protected marine areas, and other activities such as swimming, wild swimming, rowing boats, boating generally, would all need to be monitored to make sure there was no impact. It was a really quite draconian set of measures that was just going to sterilise anything happening within 10% of Scottish waters. What we didn't know was what 10% was it going to be. And when the proposals were first became public in 2022, there was absolute horror throughout coastal and island Scotland. Rural communities saw this proposal as being ill thought out, lacking in science, and really going to have devastating consequences for some very fragile communities. And I don't know if any of you are aware of the Celtic rock band called Skippinish. And what started out as a diverse campaign by a variety of organisations, fishing organisations, fish farming organisations, and wider communities around Scotland, the whole campaign against highly protected marine areas was catalysed by Skippinish. Skippinish is a very well-known Celtic rock band, and when COVID hit, like all bands, they could no longer perform, so everybody in the band had to find something else to do. One of the lead members of the band, Angus MacPhail, had been a fisherman before he went into his full-time music, and so he'd gone back to Barra and bought a small boat with one of his friends, and they were fishing with creels for crab and lobster. And he told me that he was sitting in the bar in the Barra Hotel one evening when discussion started about highly protected marine areas, and the penny dropped. He said, well, if part of the 10% is going to be around Barra and Battersea, that means all the people who fish from these two small islands will have nowhere to fish. They'll lose their jobs. And he began to say, this is exactly how our ancestors must have felt when they were cleared off the land in the 19th century by lairds. They felt helpless, they felt angry, but there was nothing they could do about it. And he said all the fishers in Barra that evening, when they were talking, were feeling equally helpless. And then Angus thought, well, he had something that his ancestors didn't have, and that was the power of his music. So the next day at sea, he quickly composed the clearances again, where he highlighted the highly protected marine area proposal as a new type of clearance. In the 19th century, the landowners, the lairds, threw the people off the land to make way for sheep. In the 21st century, Angus said that the people were also going to be thrown away from their islands, but this time not by lairds. They were being thrown off their land by the green lairds, the green activists who were living in the cities of Scotland. I don't know if you've seen the video, but it's a wonderful song, and I'm just going to play it. It doesn't take that long. It's in Gaelic, of course. I haven't written in Ballad. Difficult to follow that. Wonderful song. It immediately went to number 4 in the UK charts. It won all the prestigious BBC Alba Awards, and at the Fishing Expo in Aberdeen earlier this year, it won the award for the best innovation. And it was up against people who designed nets and boats and fishing gear and engines. But it's the first time a song has ever won that award at the fishing show in Aberdeen. A huge success, and it, as I said, galvanized the campaign against highly protected marine areas. And it was quite incredible to see that campaign, which took off in different places, getting behind Skipponish and their song. And I remember thinking at the time, it takes a special type of government incompetence to unite rural Scotland completely. And there's a message there if there are any members of either of the two parties here tonight. Now, the highly protected marine area proposal was the result of a political compromise, the coalition agreement. It could only be undone through politics. And Fergus Ewing, Scottish National Party member who had been Fisheries Minister, was furious. He felt that his party had made a huge error ever agreeing to this. It just flew in the face of everything he'd worked for, he argued, as Fisheries Minister, to have a truly sustainable and viable and prosperous fishing industry in Scotland, employing many people in rural and remote parts of the community. He was absolutely furious, and he blamed this whole concept on what he called the wine bar revolutionaries, These were the Green Party activists who had never, he said, had ever got their hands dirty by working the land or working the sea. They were, he said, wine bar revolutionaries sitting in Edinburgh. He took the consultation paper and he tore it up in the Scottish Parliament. He lost the SNP whip, but by then the campaign had really reached a tremendous head of steam with huge political support against it. So eventually the government did what I think they had to do, and they abandoned the highly protected marine area proposal in 2023, last year. The last time I spoke to Angus MacPhail, we were reflecting on this, and he said that he was proud of what Skipponish had done to help win what he called the battle. But he said, the war hasn't been won. This will come back. The Green activists are not happy that their proposal had been lost, and it will reappear. He had no doubt of that. And I'm sure he's absolutely right. Now, the second example I'm going to use looks at fish farming. In the 1990s, salmon farming came to British Columbia. Salmon farming is huge, as you probably know, in Norway, in Chile, in Scotland, in Faroe, and in British Columbia. Here in Orkney and in Shetland, whole of Scotland, there's some fish farming. Salmon farming is now very, very important in terms of the climate-smart food it produces and the jobs it creates. It came to British Columbia in the 1990s. There was huge excitement in British Columbia. Here was a chance to create jobs in very remote and rural parts of the province where there had been limited employment opportunities. And it was producing high-quality food with a low-carbon footprint. What was there not to like? But after fish farming became established and was getting established in British Columbia, it was clear that there was a lot of opposition. And much of this opposition came from the United States, from some of the green foundations in the United States, prominent of which was the Pew Foundation. It was ironic that the Pew Foundation, all of their money had been made from the oil industry 100 years previously. And the US dollars poured across the border, and this money from the United States funded about 10 or 12 NGOs in British Columbia who were all opposing, for various reasons, salmon farming. Some from visual aspects, others because they were opposed to the farming of fish, and so on. And all of these NGOs were incredibly well funded. They were able to employ marine biologists, they were able to employ professional campaigners, media experts, and the net result was that over a period of about 10 to 15 years, they changed the narrative in British Columbia. There had been general support for fish farming, but the relentless campaigning by these NGOs, which were supported by the media, were able to change the narrative. And it would be an interesting study in campaigning to see how effective it had been. It was well funded. It was carried out by about 10 or 12 NGOs. A number of well-known celebrities joined in: Leonardo DiCaprio, Pamela Anderson, and William Shatner from Star Trek fame. It seemed to be that whenever there was publicity, a lot of these celebrities simply joined in because it was good publicity for them as well. And the uncritical media, yet again, gave the anti-salmon farming campaign in British Columbia huge coverage. The fish farming industry tried to answer the criticism, and it was busy doing its work, farming fish. It probably, with hindsight, should have done more. But the net result is that 2 months ago, the federal government of Canada decided to ban salmon farming. By 2029, the farming of salmon in British Columbia will be illegal. If you try to farm salmon in the province of British Columbia after that date, you'll be sent to jail. The consequences will be severe. About 6,000 well-paid jobs in some really remote parts of the province will be lost. And the production of around 70,000 tonnes of climate-smart food, of salmon with one of the lowest carbon footprints on the planet, will be lost. But the most ironic thing of all is that all of the people in Vancouver, the mega city in British Columbia, where more than half the population live, while all of the people in Vancouver, or most of the people, got behind the anti-salmon farming narrative, they continue to eat salmon. They love it. It's the most popular, one of the most popular foods that's eaten in British Columbia. And the result of the ban will be that Canada will have to import 70,000 tonnes of salmon, and that will probably be imported from Norway or Chile. It'll probably be flown to Canada. And you can imagine the carbon footprint of that salmon when it's eaten by people in British Columbia compared with the carbon footprint that might have been had the salmon been produced locally. Now, I used that example and the previous example of the highly protected marine areas to illustrate the challenges which the modern seafood industry is facing. The fishing industry in Scotland and the salmon farming industry in British Columbia. I could have used other examples. There are many around the world. And that's where I come back to what I spoke to begin with. Why is this happening? What has changed? Why 20 years ago was this really close collaboration between a vigorous NGO movement that was cajoling the fishing industry and the fish farming industry to do better? Why has that all changed? Why has it happened? It's very difficult. It's very difficult to try and identify that. Obviously, there are different views. You know, the radical NGOs have very strong views about how they want to see fisheries and fish farming undertaken. The seafood industry has other views. There's nothing wrong with that. The divergence of views is good. That's healthy. What's wrong is that the two sides don't sit down and talk it through. But why has this happened? The seafood industry hasn't changed from where it was 20 years ago. It's just become more sustainable. It's become more aware of its low carbon footprint. But the NGO sector has changed. It's become more radical, less able to compromise, and unwilling to sit down with the seafood industry. Now, why has that happened? I think one reason is an urban-rural divide throughout the world, and even in Scotland. A few years ago, an old university friend of mine's, who I hadn't seen for a long time, came up to Shetland. He'd grown up in Glasgow. We'd gone to university together. We'd been very, very good friends. We still were. We kept in touch, but we hadn't seen each other for a long time. So when he arrived in Shetland, I was keen to give him the full Shetland treatment. So I said, we'll go out catching mackerel. Lovely summer day. We went out and we caught mackerel. Any of you who've fished for mackerel will know that when the mackerel come on board, they flap around a lot, they make a lot of noise, banging on the wooden floor of the boat. I always cut the gills. I think that improves the flesh quality and also means the fish die more quickly. There's a lot of blood around. I could see he was disconcerted. He'd never caught fish in his life. He's not a vegan. He eats fish. He eats meat. And then I filleted the mackerel on the way ashore, so there was even more blood and there was guts. And what really was just the most natural thing in the world to me, to go out to sea and catch my own food, was unnatural and alien to him. His idea of fish was to go into a supermarket and buy a piece of fish in a polystyrene package, desensitized, completely unaware of where fish and meat actually come from. Whereas in rural Scotland and farms and coastal communities, we know how we get our fish. We know how we catch our fish or farm our fish. So I believe that the urban and rural divide is part of the reason for this change. In rural Scotland, the sea is a source of food and a source of jobs. For many people in urban Scotland, the sea is some mystical wilderness that we should leave well alone. Later on that week, my friend and I went out to a restaurant in Lerwick, And I was sitting at the menu, and I said, I quite fancied the monkfish. I'd had it there before, it was really good. Oh, he says, there's no way I'm ever going to eat fish after seeing you catching those mackerel. I'm going to have the meatballs instead. So I think that disconnect between rural and urban society is part of the issue. I think another thing is an element of class. If you go online and look at the people who are the trustees of some of these radical NGOs, there's a high preponderance of very rich, privately educated and entitled people who regard people who fish, and even people who farm fish, regard them as very working class. And you often see that in the imagery that some of these NGOs produce. Fishermen are often portrayed as unshaven old men with teeth missing and smoking a roll-up, completely belying the fact that there are many young men and women who fish who want to be part of this wonderful sustainable industry with a low carbon footprint. I was at an event a few years ago where one of the founders of the Blue Marine Foundation was talking to an audience of environmentalists and explaining to them how his foundation, the Blue Marine Foundation, well-funded, sophisticated organisation in London, had gone to Lyme Bay in the south of England, and they taught the Lyme Bay fishers how to fish sustainably, how to market their catches, how to look after their catches. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was almost as if I was listening to a Victorian governor in Delhi talking about civilizing the natives. I put my hand up and I said, surely it was a two-way process. Surely you learned something from the fishers. And of course, he was clever enough to see the point I was making. And he said, oh yes, of course we learned. But it was clear to me, and I think most people in the audience, it had never occurred to him that he could learn anything from working class fishers. These radical NGOs are often referred to by fishermen in England and Scotland as the posh boys. And finally, and this is where the press comes in, it's much easier to sell a simple lie than to explain a complex truth. There's many examples of this in the press, but if you see a headline that is very simple, easy to understand, it's very easy for people to live with that. The truth can be more complex. A very, very good example was in 2021 when an environmental campaigner called Eric Sala produced a paper looking at the impact of trawling on the seabed. And he calculated that trawling the seabed around the world released 370 million tons of carbon dioxide. Imagine how much carbon dioxide is in 1 ton. 370 million tons. It was more than the aviation industry released. It went viral. It was on every newscast. It was on every radio station. It went on social media. Everybody was quite rightly shocked. 370 million tons of CO2 released by bottom trawling. Immediately, some people who had been studying this for years, led by Professor Jan Hendrik from the University of Anglesey, examined Sala's original work. And they found that not only were his assumptions wrong, but his methodology was seriously flawed. And it was concluded that his estimate of CO2 emissions had been exaggerated by at least 1,000%. Needless to say, that got no headlines. And there are millions of people around the world now who believe that gigantic proportions of CO2 are released by bottom trawling, when the reality is it was a simple lie and the complex truth hasn't got through. So very quickly, and I know time is running out, what needs to be done? The seafood industry has to recognize it still has lots to do. It has further improvements to make, but it's done reasonably well. However, it has to recognize it must have a social license to operate. Society must approve of fishing and fish farming. And if society doesn't approve of fishing and fish farming, as has happened in British Columbia with salmon farming, it then will no longer be able to continue these activities. Transparency is the key. The NGO community, especially the radical NGO community, must work with the seafood industry, and they must demonstrate that they accept the right of the fishing industry and the fish farming industry to exist. They must make that absolutely clear. And finally, the media must become far more responsible. Instead of simply running with the headlines they think will sell most papers or get most airtime, they've got to interrogate a lot of these simplistic scare stories. And not simply rehash what they've been given without any thought. Then, and only then, do I hope that the seafood industry and the NGO community can work again in a more collaborative fashion and work together so that the seafood industry can realise its full potential with its incredible ability to produce food with the lowest carbon footprint on the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Right, okay, so I've got a couple of questions on Slido, but before I go into the others, see if anybody's got any questions in the room. Yes.
What were the reasons that the fish farming got banned in British Columbia?
The reason was the intensive campaign by a dozen NGO organisations, and the arguments they were putting forward were similar to the arguments against fish farming in Scotland. The arguments were that it was unnatural to farm fish at sea. This was a pristine area. There shouldn't be industrial. They always called it industrial fish farming with salmon packed into pens. And when they were told, when they had to answer, well, how are you going to produce salmon in British Columbia if not at sea? They said, well, let's grow them on land. Let's grow them in land-based salmon units where the stocking densities are 5 times higher and the carbon footprint is much higher. They then used the arguments which are used in Scotland that sea lice could transfer from a salmon farm onto wild salmon, or there could be, if there were escapes, there could be genetic introgression. The reality is that Atlantic salmon, the 5 species of Pacific salmon have a much higher resistance to sea lice than do Atlantic salmon, and there would be no risk of genetic introgression because Atlantic salmon is a completely different species to the 5 Pacific salmon species. So it were all of these arguments, but I think it wasn't so much the arguments, it was the effective way these fallacious and false arguments were deployed. They got people convinced this was a bad industry. It was portrayed as an industrial industry, it was polluting the seabed. And when facts were deployed to answer these criticisms, they really had very little effect. The narrative was so good. You had Leonardo DiCaprio and Pamela Anderson and William Shatner and others saying what a terrible industry this was. And the narrative was changed, and people just made up their mind. It was bad. And that urban-based society of British Columbia went with that narrative and is being banned. At the same time as it was banned, as the announcement that it was being banned was made, the fisheries ministers of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada, where there's also fish farming, but these are rural communities. These aren't big and urbanized communities. Huge, overwhelming support for fish farming. They said, our shores are open for fish farming. Please relocate here. So if fish farming was so bad, why is the east coast of Canada really keen to have it and the west coast of Canada so against it? So it's a fascinating study in campaigning. Nothing to do with facts, but to do with a really effective campaign funded by American dollars.
Thank you. With reference to your last slide there, what's the incentive for the NGO community to work more closely with the seafood industry?
You know what? Thank you very much for that question. I think that's an incredibly interesting question. I would like to think that if the NGO community are really wanting to see a viable, sustainable seafood industry, fishing and fish farming, that would be the incentive to work with the industry. However, I do in my darkest days wonder if that really is their agenda. Is there really an incentive? The agenda of some people that I read, they want to see huge areas of the sea closed to any activity whatsoever. And if that's their agenda, and I'm not for a minute suggesting it is for all of them, certainly is for one or two individuals, then there's no incentive whatsoever to engage constructively with the seafood industry. And that's what worries me, because you can see in British Columbia how an effective campaign can galvanise a community, and you can get a political reaction which destroys job, leads to a greater carbon footprint, and it just shows not only how that can happen to a community, but how daft some politicians can react to that.
We'll just go just there and then we'll come across the middle.
I've only been fishing twice in my life. One was out on the Outer Hebrides, and the other one was out on the west coast of Canada, where my aunt has a flying fishing lodge. So I was very interested in what you were saying about that. And yes, I will be emailing my aunt when I get home tonight. What effect is the sports fishery in this? Because I know my aunt has had to battle with governments. She's had the place since the 90s, where they wanted to alter the quotas for salmon stocks and her fishing lodge catching salmon. And the issue mainly was, because the salmon was coming through US waters from Alaska, was the overfishing to the north, not so much any effect of sports fisheries, which brought in millions, still brings in millions of dollars to the BC and Canadian economy. So to what extent was sports fishery affected by this?
Well, I suppose that unlike Scotland, in BC you've got a wild salmon catch, both sports and commercial fishery, whereas in Scotland there's no wild salmon, or very, very limited wild salmon catch. And in BC, the salmon farming industry was developed and expanded, and it wasn't affected at all by the wild salmon fishery at all. Probably if there was a really good wild salmon catch, then prices maybe went down a little bit, but it was a quite separate industry, so there was really no impact whatsoever. But it's interesting that many of the people who were opposed to fish farming and were saying, salmon should be allowed to run free, and we have this huge commercial fishery and it should be allowed to be the only salmon that's produced. The reality is that most of the salmon that's caught in the commercial fishery in Alaska and British Columbia, the smolts that go to sea are all reared in hatcheries. They're all farmed and then released at sea. So it's very, very interesting. And I'll be interested to hear what your aunt says when you email her.
Whilst we just, I think there's a question around here. I'm just going to take a couple questions from Slido whilst the microphone's just travelling, and then we'll just come on. We'll have one more question in the room after this. So there's a couple of questions here around sustainability. And so the first question is, you've mentioned the culture war. Would you not agree, though, that there's a long way to go in terms of improving sustainability in fishing, which is around nets and fuel? And the second question is about the similar. So how do you manage with overfishing with sustainability?
Yeah, two very good points. Of course, there's always improvements can always be made. However, in the Marine Stewardship Council, there's a global standard for sustainability. You've got 3 principles. Principle number 1, the state of the stock. Principle number 2, what's the management system like? Principle number 3, impact on the wider environment. You've got 60 criteria arising from these principles, and each fishery is assessed scientifically and objectively against these 3 criteria. You have to get an 80% pass rate to become MSC certified. It's a global standard. Only 15% of global fisheries are MSC certified, which basically says the vast majority of global fisheries are not well managed and are not sustainable. However, in Scotland, in Europe, in North America, most fisheries are MSC certified or are in fisheries improvement programs, bringing them very close to MSC certification. So once you get to that standard, of course, there are constant improvements, but it's like, somebody once said, You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're either not MSC certified or you are MSC certified. You know, that's it. You've got there. The big battle has to be to get the other 85% of global fisheries which are not MSC certified up to the mark. Many are not far away, but some parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Africa, there's no fisheries management. Stocks are grossly overfished, and so attention has to be paid on that. So I'm not painting a picture that global fisheries are anything like great. I am saying that for Scotland, for Europe, fisheries are pretty well managed. And if you're at the MSC standard, of course, you can constantly look to get more improvements. But the focus really needs to be on those parts of the world where fisheries aren't well managed.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's a really interesting talk. I was just wondering, going forward into the future, how do you think the fishing sector and the NGOs can start working together? How can we start building that trust to get to that space we want to be?
Very, very good question. And relates to the question this gentleman raised earlier about what's the incentive for the NGO community if really their objective is to sterilise huge areas for fishing. And what's the incentive then for the seafood industry to talk to that group of people? But I'm an optimist, and I do believe there are sufficient people in the NGO community who really do want to see fisheries made better. And I think the seafood industry has to play its part and has to be prepared to sit down and talk with people who have dramatically different views, but to try and find some common cause. Because ultimately, everyone, whether a radical NGO, a moderate NGO, or somebody who's a fish farmer or a fisherman, everybody has the interests of having a healthy marine ecosystem with sustainable practices, either fishing or fish farming. It's got to be in everyone's interests to achieve that. But it will be difficult. There's a lot of, when you reach a new culture war and people talk in silos, a lot of things are said that shouldn't be said from both points of view, so it won't be easy. And I do look back to that very safe space of 20 years ago when progress was made, when people had very different views, but there was an element of trust. It was a safe space, and I think that element of trust has gone and needs to be rebuilt. And I guess it's people like you, Hannah, who are leaders in the industry, who have to play your part, together with the responsible elements of the NGO movement, who have to play their part and try and get together.
Thank you very much. Right. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our session for today. And thank you very much for your questions. I'll copy in there's a... Okay, so we have come to the end of our session. John, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Really appreciated that. And yes, big round of applause. Thank you.